I'm afraid that those opposite Mr Speaker are going to have to put up with the most deadly combination in post-war politics, Hawke and Keating.
Keating polled 5 votes ahead of Bob Hawke, 56 to 51.
If this was 11 years ago, I'd be getting pretty thoroughly drunk.
This is a victory for the true believers.
1991 was a disastrous year for Australia. Here in the nation's capital, government was paralysed as Hawke and Keating fought out a totally consuming battle for leadership. The paralysis struck at a time when the country was descending into its worst recession for 60 years.
I would say that literally, we threw that year away. Threw it away. We absolutely... And in a 3-year government, and I mean, I've got to say, I still feel bitter and twisted about it. I do.
Not nearly as much should have happened in that 12 months as should have. No doubt about that. But it's a very, very easy criticism to make of Bob Hawke when you look at what was going on within that government, where in fact people were playing a role, a bit like guerrilla warfare, against the Prime Minister.
Well, neither of them had much to be proud of, I guess, in terms of the way the whole issue was conducted. In terms of the electorate, I mean, and their reaction, it was pretty much a choice between arsenic and strychnine.
The idea that the rest of us should beaver away and be producing tricks and say, well, how's this for an act? And after that's over, now let me do another one for you, and how's that one? And what about another one? And do this for year after year after year, was Bob sort of adjudicating, giving marks. Well, you know, that was no longer possible.
Part of his whole argument, of course, was that Labor had had its term, or more than its natural term, and that there was virtually no chance of winning the next election, and so if he didn't have a turn now, he'd never get it.
There are flashes of light. It appears to be some sort of anti-aircraft fire.
When Iraq triggered the Gulf War in January 1991, Keating's lunge for the leadership was stalled. He considered resigning from Cabinet, but the time was not right.
The Keating office decided that with the strength of the war behind Hawke, with the rise in the polls that he enjoyed from that, with the Cabinet knuckled down to the preparation of the March industry statement, that it would just be counterproductive to make public the Kirribilli agreement. So in effect we decided to keep mum and hope something would turn up.
The Gulf War was a temporary distraction from ever-worsening jobless figures. Hawke and Keating completely misjudged the state of the economy. In March 1991, in their final act of professional cooperation, they slashed tariffs.
I now announce the general level of assistance will be reduced from 10% and 15% in 1992 to a general rate of 5% by 1996.
It was a decision that made the jobless queues longer. It was the first of a series of mistakes that fatally undermined Hawke's leadership.
I thought the phase down, which we announced in March of 1991, was probably a bit quick, moving 15% tariffs to 5% tariffs by the year 1996. Keating and Hawke both took a different view from me on that, and I didn't argue it in the cabinet because I knew I wasn't going to win, because they both rang me before the cabinet meeting.
I said to Paul, look, I don't want this statement much unless you got it absolutely right, because if you haven't got it right, we're going to be in lots of problems. And when I saw Bob in February, I more or less put that view, said you've got to make sure this is right. In retrospect, there's one time I really felt that I didn't go in hard enough, because I just did not believe that they got the economy right, that they judged it right. And it made a hell of a difference to that statement. I mean, if the economy was on the upturn, then you could do a few things in terms of tariffs and other policies. But if the economy was not, if the economy was still grovelling along in the bottom and prospectively going down further, and some of the things that they're talking about was going to compound the problem, would add nothing to confidence.
Now, orthodoxy won, but it was challenged quite significantly, I think. It was a good debate where, without fear or favour, the line was challenged, and it should have been. If you look at what happened then a year later when Keating had the reins, while Keating had been taking the orthodox line then completely, he wasn't taking it a year later.
But in hindsight, that statement should have been a political statement. It should have been much more about the future, much more about the whole settings of policy than simply about industry policy. And I think had it been, we would have gained a year instead of lost a year in terms of the fight against the recession.
I move that this House censures the Prime Minister for his lack of leadership and failure in economic policy, which has put 1 million Australians out of work.
The opposition lashed Hawke mercilessly. His strident responses failed to inspire confidence.
Well, visiting professor, look up the statistics of your recession, the one in which you guided the Conservative government. And you were unique, as we've said before. You were absolutely unique.
And of course, he always used to go one step too far. Oh, in Parliament, always used to. Every time he tried to get a bit smart and sort of sling off at the opposition, and the voice would go up that sort of extra, sort of half an octave. And you'd think, oh my God. And all his supporters would be hiding under their desks with paper bags over their heads. I mean, it was terrible.
I must say, after that shrill and excitable performance from the Prime Minister, it is no wonder that your own backbench are literally openly in the corridors of this place saying that it's time you went.
Keating and his New South Wales right-wing mates agreed. They sent Graham Richardson in to threaten Hawke. The Kirribilli agreement on leadership succession would be leaked if the Prime Minister didn't step down.
So I realised then that this was fairly serious, because by any measure, Graham Richardson was an enormously powerful influence in the right-wing of New South Wales, which had been a consistent supporting bloc of me. And so I knew that we now had a reasonably serious situation.
It was a case of either walk away and not mention the fact that we'd made an agreement at Kirribilli House. In other words, let Bob get away with it, or stand him up.
Hawke refused to step down, and in the late afternoon of May 30, Keating's patience snapped. In a highly agitated state, he stormed around to Hawke's office. The Prime Minister was in a meeting with Queensland Premier Wayne Goss and Union leader Bill Ludwig.
I knew he was by nature impatient, but I must say I was rather surprised when he came bursting in and said, I've got to see you. And I said, well, sorry, Paul, I'll see you later. You can see I've got people here, and when I've finished with them, I'll see you. And so he huffed and puffed out, and I went on with my meeting.
And I thought that was the thing to do. It had come far enough, the obfuscation and the sort of duplicity had come far enough, and I wasn't going to bear another minute of it.
Well, then when I'd finished the meeting with Goss and Ludwig, he came in and just very directly told me that he was going to challenge, and I said, all right, that's the way it's going to be, Paul. That was it.
And it was his decision to challenge. He wasn't pushed into it by anyone. He just woke up one morning and said, I've had enough. This is it. It's on. And it's on now. I mean, he wasn't even prepared to wait a matter of weeks. It was all done very hurriedly.
That night, the whole of Australia knew about the Kirribilli Agreement. The Keating forces leaked it to Channel 9.
The Hawke-Keating leadership rivalry first surfaced back in 1988, when Mr Hawke refused to step aside in favour of his treasurer. But now I've learned that Mr Keating has given Labor colleagues details of an undertaking he says he received at the time from the Prime Minister.
And I was just shocked. And I thought, I can't believe this. Because a lot of people try to fob it off afterwards, oh, well, it was just a political promise. But of course, it was nothing of the sort. It was a personal promise that Bob Hawke had made to Keating under the most intense circumstances.
I thought there's probably at least 2 members of the caucus that were shocked by it. All the others was feigned shock, just part of the tactics, part of the justifications for stabbing a leader in the back, etc.
This is AM, coming to you from Parliament House in Canberra. I'm Peter Thompson. Good morning. As AM goes to air this morning, history is being made in the Labor caucus meeting at Parliament House. The caucus has assembled to make its most difficult choice since coming to government in 1983.
I remember arriving at Parliament House at about 7 a.m, having gone to bed at about 4:30 a.m. that morning, to see the whole of the Parliament enveloped in this very dense fog that only the city of Canberra seems to generate. And thinking to myself, this could be a set from The Hound of the Baskervilles, and listening for the hound over the moors and the tale of impending doom.
For the first time, a serving Labor Prime Minister has been challenged. And for the first time, caucus meetings called to deal with the leadership have been fruitless.
Nobody moved anything, so the meeting was closed.
Well, I didn't take the opportunity.
The day was an anticlimax. Hawke and Keating circled each other, but neither would strike. All they agreed on was to set the following Monday as the time when the challenge would occur. The lobbying continued over the weekend.
I mean, Bob was friendly and fairly laid back, and was calling because he was calling. I mean, and Keating, and this is the difference here, Keating. I mean, having a conversation with Keating at this stage is like running a marathon, you know. And just the intensity of the man. And I can remember look, mate, you know, etc. But the last thing Paul said to me, I mean, really summed it up. And literally, I mean, sort of the hand came out. I'm 3,000 kilometres away in Darwin, but the hand came out of the end of the telephone, sort of grabbed me. And Paul said to me, this is on Sunday night, he said, listen, mate, I don't want your vote tomorrow. I want your soul. And I can remember saying to him, oh, we'll just settle for my body. But he wasn't in a very joking mood. Overwhelmingly, the editorials and the political columnists and much of the comment came down for Keating. And it was quite astonishing, the wave of support that appeared.
What sort of adjectives could you describe the role of the media, June to December 1991? Craven, bloodlusting, incompetent, biased, bigoted. None of them adequately described the way Hawke was treated by the gallery, nearly all the gallery.
Monday, June 3.
Morning all.
Caucus assembles again. This time, the battle will happen.
This morning, Paul Keating will almost certainly be the loser in the caucus room vote at 10 o'clock.
The Prime Minister Bob Hawke has beaten off the leadership bid by Paul Keating, and the former Treasurer and Deputy Prime Minister has headed for the backbench and perhaps out of politics altogether.
There was a party held in Keating's office that night which, if any stranger had attended, they would have assumed that Keating had in fact won June challenge. I mean, the atmosphere was a joyous one, and the drinks flowed till late in the evening, and just the feeling that it wasn't over yet.
I mean, Bob then had the opportunity. He had me out of the way. He had the leadership intact. He had enough of a margin to stick in there. He then had what he wanted for so long, the chance to kick the ball himself and not be kicking it with me or looking at me, over his shoulder at me. And they sat down and produced a budget and etc. But, you know, I doubted they'd get the zing back into the thing, and subsequently he didn't, of course.
In his own colourful way, he said to me one day that he was in the coffin and we forgot to put the nails in the lid. And in a sense, I think he's right about that. But he got out of that coffin and was able to fight another battle.
Keating cried havoc and let loose the dogs of war. Ruthlessly, remorselessly, Keating supporters like Gary Punch and Chris Shott created an atmosphere of crisis.
Constantly carping at every meeting, at every social occasion, constantly bagging Hawke, leaking constantly to the gallery, trolling through upstairs in the second and third floor with the latest story to hurt Hawke. That is, destabilisation of the worst and the most disloyal kind. And I just have absolute contempt for that behaviour.
And there was leaking to the press and briefing to the press, and the sort of affirmation of their intention to fight it out, with the worst offender actually saying in the office of one of my supporters, we'll go on with this, we'll take the government into opposition if it's necessary. And it's almost impossible to measure just how debilitating that sort of attitude and those sort of activities were.
Two weeks after the challenge, Coronation Hill in Kakadu National Park became the focus of frustration over Hawke's leadership. Following years of indecision, Cabinet finally had to make up its mind whether mining should be permitted in this place or not.
5.5 hours, we slogged it out, toe to toe, Bob Hawke and me. And with a great deal of, I have to say, intense involvement by other cabinet ministers. I mean, probably, I think, in a sense, I don't think there's ever been a more intense, hard-fought cabinet debate in the history of the Hawke government than that Coronation Hill debate.
The local Aboriginal people were opposed to mining on religious grounds. Many in Cabinet were not convinced by their arguments, but Hawke was.
As I said in the Cabinet debate, and said with some passion, indeed ferocity, the hypocrisy of people who claim adherence to the Christian religion, who can easily accommodate the mystery of the Holy Trinity, pouring scorn upon the beliefs of others because it doesn't make sense, just left me appalled beyond measure. And I know that many in the Cabinet, including some of my own supporters, were angry about the passion that I displayed in that debate, more passion than I displayed than at any other time of my Prime Ministership in a Cabinet meeting.
Hawke behaved very poorly at that meeting. He misjudged it, essentially. And he made a speech which alienated his supporters.
I think he argued the case atrociously on that occasion. And I remember it because that was a rare occurrence. I don't think his brief was good, and he didn't argue it well, in my view.
At the end of all this, I mean, people just sat there in total silence. And there was Bob sitting there, stuffed. There's 3/4 of his cabinet lined up against him, and he sat there, silent. Silent. And I was sitting there, like, thinking, well, what's going to happen now? I didn't know. And I thought, well, something's got to happen. And the seconds ticked past, and he just sat there. And everyone looked at him. And finally, I can still, he put his head down, and he said, well, you know, if people feel, you know, that strongly about it, and if, you know, and if, if that's how intense people feel about it, well, you know, maybe we should have another look at it. So that's what did it. That's what triggered Kim off.
What I said at the time really to Bob was, OK, well, look, we've talked this out as far as we can go. This is a point of time when it doesn't really matter what we all as individual ministers feel. You've heard our views. Basically, this is now a matter for you.
And Kim leant across the table and pointed his finger at Hawke. And he said, listen, Bob, make a decision. Make a decision. Just devastating stuff for Hawke. I mean, this coming from Beazley. In other words, he was saying to him, listen, you bloody gormless little shit, do something. And everyone knew that. And we're waiting for you for leadership, Bob. That's what he was saying. Lead.
There was a tenseness at that meeting which you had to go back a long way to find. The Prime Minister, obviously, had really put his authority on the line on that issue. And, of course, it may have been the first time in the history of the Hawke years where that may not have necessarily worked.
And Hawke said, and everyone sat there, and Hawke said, close it down. And you could hear it, the room, there was just this audible, people just said, oh, shit, right around the room. And of course, normally, courtesy, unless the Prime Minister's going off to a press conference or something, I mean, people normally remain seated until he leaves, and people just started walking out of the room.
If, against my expectations, the Cabinet had sought to push it to a vote, and if they had, the numbers would have been against me on this, then I believe that I would have given very serious consideration to resigning, because it was just something that went to the most profound of my beliefs, and I could not, I think, have been associated with a decision that went that way.
What hung in the air over all of it, of course, was the leadership. The leadership.
Vice President of the USSR, Gennady Yanayev, took office from Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev because Gorbachev is unable to perform his presidential duties.
The Soviet army is on the streets of Moscow, and the worst fears of supporters of democracy have now been realised.
August 1991, a bad time for leaders. Tanks in the streets of Moscow signal the beginning of the end of Mikhail Gorbachev. A day later in Australia, a budget is delivered by new Treasurer John Kerin that will signal the beginning of the end of Bob Hawke.
The task we face is to ensure that the recovery proceeds at a sustainable pace and that we lock in the economic gains of the past year. These gains relate particularly to the current account and the rate of inflation.
Treasury was opposed to fighting the recession by spending more and going for growth. This, combined with a wretched fear of Paul Keating, meant Kerin produced a budget that failed economically and politically.
It was a disappointing year.
The budget was pathetic, and Bob's mini economic statement at Christmas was so meaningless that he could have forgotten about giving it. And I thought, well, this shouldn't happen. And I'd argued strongly with Kerin, but more importantly with Ralph Willis over all that period. And the faith I'd had with Ralph, I'd always supported him and liked him, and actually believed in him for a great number of years. I found him and John Kerin leading Australia's economic performance into a hole. I just thought it was terrible.
We were bound to put in place
the Keating budget, which was agreed on May 22nd, the whole budget strategy, we knew we couldn't divert from that. And some of us didn't think that was really appropriate, particularly as we became closer to budget day and got more and more information.
And what stuck in John Kerin's craw as this developed, of course, was the fact that the basic framework and strategy of the budget was formulated by Paul Keating himself. As we'd had the first meetings, the first budgetary preparations, with Paul Keating still as Treasurer.
If we'd have diverted greatly from that, the Keating forces would have used that on the right, and the swingers heading his way, saying that all the years of discipline and very good policy were being thrown away. So we thought we were caught, and the ERC and Cabinet had agreed to the budget strategy. Well, certainly the ERC had.
Paul Keating and his supporter John Dawkins were thoroughly determined to exploit Hawke and Kerin's failure of nerve. Keating sailed into breathtaking criticism of the interest rate policy he had helped engineer for the past 3 years.
I've been out of the job 5 months and interest rates have fallen now by only 1%, and I don't think that's been enough.
Amongst the many hypocritical statements and sort of actions that Paul took during this period, that had to rank very highly. The position, of course, was that under his treasurership, the high interest rate structure had emerged, and he had resisted calls from a number of quarters, maybe correctly, but I'm simply saying he had been a bulwark against what he saw as moving too quickly.
Employment Minister and Keating supporter John Dawkins today turned his guns on the left after a weekend of leak and counter-leak over his role, or lack of it, in Cabinet's efforts, or lack of them, for the unemployed.
Well, I'm not sure that I was deliberately involved in destabilisation. I must say that I was less cautious in what I said than perhaps I would have been under other circumstances, and that and basically because I thought there wasn't much future in the government under that leadership, and therefore I thought we were dealing with a government whose days were numbered.
When you took decisions, you expected particularly people who were part of those decisions to back you, and when they walked away from the decisions, then you felt that that you were being betrayed. And you know, it's one thing to stand outside of the ERC and fight it out, as I did in '87, and I think I gave as much as I got. It's another having become part of a group that necessarily must make difficult decisions and must try to make the numbers add up, to be betrayed by people who were really your former comrades.
You're the top. You're the Louvre Museum. You're the top. You're the Colosseum. Take a seat and go over there.
The photo opportunity's finished, hasn't Paul? Thank you very much. Paul Keating, yes!
Well, thank you very much for having me. I love fringe gatherings. Lovely. From the fringe back to the fringe.
Keating, meanwhile, was everywhere, lurking in the background, ready to seize the moment. He was presented with a gift from the opposition.
It says, fight back, ensuring a fairer share of the cake for all Australians.
The government was struck dumb. It didn't know what to say to a highly political, ideological document. It was trying to run around and count the sums up and do an arithmetic reply. The thing to do was an immediate political reply. But I think it basically, I mean, in the end, fight back finished Bob off, not me.
We should have treated it strictly as a political document and taken it head on politically, virtually from day one. We didn't. In retrospect, that was a mistake. It was one that was made consciously, but well, it was wrong.
We had played the games by one set of rules, and the rules changed. And once the rules had changed, then in a sense people like John, Kerin and I were sitting ducks. We were always going to be undermined and undercut, and that's what occurred. And I think that year became a year of an impossible year for good government, and it really in the end had to be resolved. And you know, so I don't feel personally badly about that, and I'm sure John Kerin doesn't. The issue simply was that good government had been suspended for a period of time while we fought out a leadership struggle.
The gross share rose, what's GOS?
The figures came out and there wasn't growth recorded by the statistician, so it wasn't going to be an easy press conference. And I'd written down GOS, which is a measure of gross operating surplus, and there's another term around that is very close to it called gross profit share, and I just simply froze on the S. It's as simple as that.
Good afternoon and welcome to Canberra. Now over to the Prime Minister, who's just about to announce that he's dumping John Kerin as Treasurer.
Prime Minister, was it your decision to move Mr Kerin, or did he decide to go himself?
It was my decision, but let me say this. I spoke to Mr Kerin by phone this morning. From Sydney, I indicated I would like to see him this morning. I put the position to him, and I can't speak highly enough of John Kerin.
We had the problems, of course, that with John, who had the problems, John Kerin, who had the problems in Treasury, who was very much undermined in what was a difficult task by the attitude of the Keating forces. I mean, when one thinks back of the nervousness, the extreme nervousness, the mistakes that were made by Paul when he was first there, no allowance made by him and his forces for Kerin in that situation.
By that time, due to the way I was handling the media, that I thought that was probably a proper decision, and it wasn't one I particularly resisted.
The moment he decided to dismiss John Kerin, which brought then the visit by the Six Ministers, was probably the start of the end of his leadership, and then fight back overlaying it just sort of finished it off.
Good morning, this is AM and I'm Maxine McHugh in Canberra. It's now widely anticipated that senior federal ministers who had previously been Hawke supporters will approach Mr Hawke and ask him to stand down from the job he has held for almost 9 years.
The media was right. Hawke's closest colleagues were blunt.
Pull out, digger, the dogs are pissing on your swag. And it's just an old, quintessentially Australian way of saying some signals are so strong, some forms of momentum are so inevitable, whether you like them or not, that the dignified thing to do is to bow to that inevitability and to retire gracefully. It was not a message, unfortunately, that Bob was very receptive to at that stage.
I mean, we were all reluctant to give in what we saw as destabilisation and political blackmail. But on the other hand, none of us then believed that there would be much difference in terms of electoral prospect between Hawke and Keating. And that for Hawke's own sake, if this destabilisation was to go on, it was better to get out then and get out on top. Back of our minds, Labor Party needs some icons.
I certainly had reached the judgment at that time, along with all the rest, that and we all had our own views about this, but the time had come for him to go.
I suppose some would have, some of us would have liked at that meeting for Bob to have given us the easy way out. Though it wasn't easy for any one of us, I think, in terms of balancing not just the political but also the personal considerations involved.
But we did want him to understand that there was no point in ringing any of us individually or getting us in collectively in a week's time if a challenge took place and said, well, you've got to get the numbers here between the lot of you, because we had to tell him we didn't think we could do that, and we did that. So then he knew.
And I wanted them to understand, and I think they did. Certainly they did in the end, that I was not staying on because I wanted the job, that it was the job that fascinated me and I just wanted to stick there. I told them, and they came to accept, that I had a profound belief that I had the best chance, certainly better than Paul Keating, of leading the government to victory at the next election.
At the end of those discussions, the Prime Minister expressed the view to the senior ministers in attendance that he intended to remain leader of the Labor Party until the next election. Senior ministers endorsed that position, and that is the situation.
I couldn't believe the bloody result when the brave six marched in and then marched out with Kim giving the doorstop, pledging everyone's eternal loyalty to the leader.
That was a bad idea. I think that certainly it was a bad idea if it couldn't be done in secrecy.
He was finished, and I mean, and I've been there too. I mean, you can recognise the smell of death, and it comes off people, you know. And Hawke gave that off every time. You knew he was finished, absolutely finished.
Then on December 18th, Keating's chief backer, Graham Richardson, told Robert Ray that a petition was being organised for a special caucus meeting to challenge Hawke. The Prime Minister considered calling a meeting himself and ambushing his opponents.
We said you could do the other thing, of course, Bob. You could do this all very clean and announce a caucus meeting for the leadership yourself. No show and tell ballots, no show of hands, no one needs to sign a petition. Within 10 minutes, Hawke had adopted this as the clean way of doing it.
Bob Hawke will face the Labor Party caucus within the hour to make one last appeal for the right to take the government to his 5th election as Prime Minister.
Tonight's ballot has been called on by Mr Hawke, who says the issue should be resolved in the least disruptive manner. When caucus meets soon, he'll resign and contest a secret ballot against Paul Keating.
Labor caucus members are filing into the ALP party room.
Time will tell. The end of the Hawke era is near, with Paul Keating's supporters confident he'll be the new Prime Minister tonight.
Bob went to the rostrum and said that it was undoubtedly the case that the Australian media wanted a change of Prime Ministership, but it was also undoubtedly the case that the party wanted him to stay. And he said we should let the party's will prevail.
Hard men and women of the Labor Party, lots of people were wiping tears, and some were close to positively just weeping. And it was a combination of all of those things. Some people were weeping at the appalling thing that had happened. Bob Hawke was defeated. They were weeping for him.
Parliamentary Labour Party have just elected a new leader, consequently a new Prime Minister of Australia. Paul Keating polled 5 votes ahead of Bob Hawke, 56 to 51. Thank you very much.
What did Keating say to caucus, Senator?
I guess the most memorable part of the meeting that sticks in my mind was how some of those who'd been most vehement in their desire for change broke down, and I suppose there was always a little bit of scepticism about my emotion, but most remarkable to me was the way some of these people broke down, and most particularly John Dawkins, who broke down completely there in the caucus room in my presence.
Oh, well, I think if Bob had won the leadership ballot, the second one, then I think he would only have won it by a handful of votes. I think his position, the government's position, would have been untenable, and I certainly think the position of those of us who were active campaigners for a change would also have been untenable, and I, for one, would have left the government.
Graham said that when he returned from his summer break, it would be his intention to resign from the Cabinet as Minister for Social Security. And we sat there and ticked off a list of Keating Cabinet Ministers who would probably resign as well. In my own mind, I think all of them would have walked. And that, had that occurred, the Hawke government would have simply disintegrated. I remember looking up at the photos of Labor leaders on the wall and thinking, well, Bob's photo will be there in a matter of weeks. And Bob was in tears by this stage, and there were two queues formed as the meeting broke up. A queue of Hawke people congratulating him, commiserating with him, and a queue of Keating people. And I will not forget the look in Bob's eyes as I shook his hand. There is no doubt that there was a burning anger still present in him, a deep resentment of the fact that he'd lost the leadership.
And then we gave Hawke 3 or 4 minutes to compose himself, and 38 members of Parliament walked back to his office with that long 400-yard walk down a corridor. It was a very emotional moment, but we wanted to stay behind and show our support for him.
You know the result of the caucus ballot, which resulted in the election of Paul Keating. And I want to say here, as I said to the caucus, that Paul Keating will have my total support. This new Keating Labor government will have my total support.
Mr. Hawke, specifically, what's your plans for the future, and where do you think you went wrong, so much so that you were voted out of office?
I thank you for that opening charitable question. The first part of the question, what am I going to be doing? Well, if this was 11 years ago, I'd be getting pretty thoroughly drunk. But fortunately, fortunately for me, and even more fortunately for others, that is 11 years ago, and the only beer that will be passing my lips will be the totally non-alcoholic variety.
The day after the ballot, the atmosphere in Hawke's suite was one of restrained sorrow, resigned activity. There was packing to do. Labor's caucus had laid waste to its most successful leader. In his last interview in the Prime Minister's suite on December 20, 1991, Hawke was exhausted, hurt.
You've taken the party to victory 4 times, and no one's ever looked like doing that before. And you know, the objective evidence from those who've studied it is that it was Hawke that got the party across the line, and you don't feel that it's the most fitting recognition of that to be beaten in a ballot for leadership. That I think the party has made a great mistake in denying itself the best opportunity of beating the Conservatives at the most important time for them to be beaten.
Hazel Hawke, for the last time departing the suite she had shared for 9 years, mourned memories that had now been defaced.
It's left a sadness because for a while, as we all know, that partnership worked very well, and the relationships with the family were very pleasant, and it's just one of those things that in politics, the politics seems to take over the personal relationships because it's a very strong and intense process. I feel disappointment, some hurt. I don't think anger, but I do feel disappointed that that was the way that Bob went.
I, Paul John Keating, do swear that I will well and truly serve Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II.
I don't think anyone could turn around our electoral fortunes in December 1991. Wasn't Robinson Crusoe on that, but there'll be a lot of rewriting of history about that. A lot of people say, yes, they're absolutely certain. I certainly was certain we couldn't. I was wrong.
I thought, well, you know, I've sort of... I'm sitting here in a sort of such a difficult position. Did I do the right thing? But I used to think, without, and I say this without any disrespect to Bob or his political abilities, which have been substantial, I don't think he showed any likelihood of catching Hewson or sparring him properly. So I thought, whichever way this is going to work out, I'm sure I'm going to do better at this than Bob would have done.
I mean, he's going, Mr. Speaker, he's going troppo.
Why won't you call an early election?
The answer is, mate, because I want to do you slowly. I want to do you slowly.
Keating's main tactic was to psychologically crack Liberal leader John Hewson. The battle in Parliament was intensely personal. His main weapon was his One Nation blueprint for the future. Released in February 1992, it seemed to represent a new direction for the arch-free market man of old.
With our strategy, within 4 years, the federal budget will return to surplus. And we'll have created another 800,000 jobs.
One Nation set a direction. I think Keating stamped on the place in February of 1992 that there was now a change in thinking, that the government that had cut and cut and cut was now prepared to spend money, not just to get Australia going again, but it was a recognition that infrastructure spending had fallen behind and we had to do it. Now, that was a major change. And everything we've done since then follows that direction.
We were fitted up with the policies and rhetoric of the 80s. We had to change that and change our position. Now, that's what we succeeded in doing over the 15 months to the election. Reordering the debate, saying there was a role for government.
The all-powerful Treasury, which Keating had for years courted and embraced, was now discredited because of the recession. Keating believed he had previously been too prone to take the advice of Treasury and the Reserve Bank.
Yes, that's probably a fair comment. Now, they were making their best judgments, but their best judgments were not good enough. That's the bank. The Treasury was saying, the economy's going to recover, we don't need a fiscal stimulus. That was wrong. The judgments lacked guile. Not just lacked an economic understanding, they lacked guile. Well, all right, you call that a mistake. We all shared in that mistake. But it only convinced me that what I should do as a Prime Minister was run much more of that policy myself. In other words, be less likely to take as given advice from the bureaucracy.
It's official, 1 million jobless. And according to John Hewson, that means 1 million reasons for getting rid of Paul Keating.
Unemployment appeared to be a political disaster. Virtually nobody in the Labor Party believed they could win the 1993 election. But Keating destroyed an opposition that had fatally handicapped itself by pushing a goods and services tax.
The truth is, they kill themselves a bit. I mean, there weren't too many Liberal feet left because they'd been shooting themselves in them for a long time. And Houston standing up in front of rallies with that Labor's got to go leading the chant was just stupid. And and not only was it stupid, it was stupid often because it was a kind of militant stupidity. I mean, there was a determination to show this stupidity off as often as possible.
Welcome back to the National Tally Room here in Canberra. We're coming live to you all around Australia in this special National 9 coverage tonight of Judgment Day.
I'd say that Labor has won the election, and this is a result which I think Labor supporters all around the country are entitled to be very, very pleased about, from the Prime Minister right through.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Well, this is the sweetest victory of all. This is a victory for the true believers.
If ever a political leader or a political party talk about people's wins, you can always, look somewhat askance. But this, if ever there was one, this was a people's win. And I think the election was a great victory for them. And the extent that I played a role in that, I'm very, very happy about it. Very happy about it.
Look, we won this election by 1%, essentially. And we've got to remember that 49% of people out there didn't vote for us, so the margin's small. We'll always have that reality hanging over our head.
I think we're getting a little carried away in the post-election glory about how well we've done and how badly the Liberals have done.
Keating's warriors were vindicated by the result. For the Hawke supporters, though, the events of December 1991 remain a blot on history.
Those who wanted change of leader because they believed electoral success was more likely under Keating than Hawke were proved right. But there's never an absolute right or wrong in these things. I apologise for no role I played in it because I think there are other principles involved. The other principle of not knocking off an existing Prime Minister, I'm sure it's one that has probably more converts these days than did at the time.
Now he's a hero. And you've got to remember about this hero, it's the most powerful hero Australia's ever seen. Keating has more power in the Labor Party than Bob Hawke ever dreamed of having. And that too will affect him, I suppose. Thus far, the power's been used wisely. He doesn't need kingmakers, he doesn't need factions. There's been no leader. The Labor Party has not needed somebody, and I don't think he needs anyone at the moment.
For 11 years, Paul Keating's ambition was like an incoming tide. First, Bob Hawke was engulfed, then the opposition. The triumph was dazzling, creating room for enemies to embrace.
I just say this, you can't have a fifth election victory without a fourth, and the bloke who gave it to us and his wife, Bob and Hazel, here tonight, thanks for coming back.
I guess it took real political skill over the years for Keating and Hawke to be able to present this public display of unity, which was obviously there for long periods. When there were tensions beneath the surface, they still were able to cooperate fully in the Parliament and appear to be a very effective team. But they had very little regard for each other privately.
I knew that it was important for the party that the relationship between us be effective, that whatever strains arose from the ambitions of the man and his quirks of personal behaviour, the way he treated most of his colleagues and just about everyone with contempt, that had to be harnessed.
My job was to keep Humpty Dumpty together, to keep the government happy and to keep it going. And that meant I had to manage my relationship with Bob in a way that kept the government happy, relaxed, confident, as though we were in charge and we were a team. And we pulled that off from 1983, largely, until 1990.
There was something else to celebrate on this night. For too long, Labor had danced to a different tune, to the discordant clash of two overwhelming ambitions, when the only true belief Hawke and Keating had was in their own destiny, when Australia suffered miserably, and when the ranks of the true believers became thinner as a result.
I think that the fact that there are now, at the end of almost a decade of government, very high levels of unemployment, you would have to put that down as the most serious failure.
We presided over the great, and if I think one can say, historic post-war transition in Australia, economic transition. I mean, Australia is now an open, competitive, market trading economy.
The big failure, which caught up with us in the end, of course, was to get on top of the balance of payments problem, which has been a chronic problem in Australia for the last 150 years probably, which occasionally becomes acute. In other words, it's not that the economy grew too fast. It didn't grow enough in the right sector.
It's not just a closed economy shipping a bit of wheat and wool. It's an economy now where the fastest growing export is elaborately transformed manufacturers, which has a substantial research and development base, which has now a strong education system powering that along, which is competitive, which has got low inflation, which has got strong fiscal position, good social policy, good safety net.
It's economic performance, it's social reconstruction, it's foreign policy, it's creation of greater equity, it's targeting of social welfare on those really in need, it's policies in regard to women. Whichever way you looked at, we had been, I believed, a very, very good government.
For Hawke and Keating, history will make all Australians true believers. The whispering sound of the jobless shuffle will be consumed in a roar of triumph. For them, opening Australia to the world is the justification of their power. But the strategy's final test is to come. Australia still lives drastically beyond its means. Failure to solve this would cause history's verdict to be harsh indeed.